Welcome to the Fleet News Group podcast, your go-to source for expert insights, industry trends and conversations with leaders shaping the future of fleet transport and mobility. I'm Mark Sibbald and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our fourth season in 2025. At Fleet News Group, we're committed to delivering relevant, insightful content, and this podcast is just one way we're bringing stories from the industry to life. You can also stay up to date with the latest industry news by visiting any of our websites, Fleet EV News, Fleet Auto News and Fleet HV News. And look out for our new quarterly magazine called All Things Fleet. That's available at industry events and conferences throughout 2025. And if you're travelling for business or pleasure, you'll find it in the Qantas Club lounges around the country. Today's guest is Mark Gjerek, founder and director of MOV3MENT. MOV3MENT helps companies and governments navigate the energy revolution sweeping across the country and the economy, specialising in the unique challenges and opportunities facing the transport sector. Mark, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting to have you here, and I almost wish we should be doing this in a couple of weeks because you're off to the States to the ACT Clean Transport Expo. So that must be an exciting thing you're looking forward to.
Yep, it's the first one I'll be attending. I've not been before. Advanced clean transportation in LA, big focus on commercial vehicles, so not necessarily just passenger cars. So there's all kinds of product and electric trucks and technologies and models that we don't get here. So I think it'll be quite eye-opening.
Yeah, well, this podcast will go live, I think, just after that show. So we look forward, hopefully you can be our roving reporter and we can post some stuff on LinkedIn, some of the photos and stuff that you take.
Absolutely, I'll do that.
Yeah, so hopefully listeners, you've seen a bit of that on LinkedIn by the time this podcast has been published. But let's start by telling the audience about yourself and the work you do at MOV3MENT. Can you give us a brief overview of how, because you founded the business, how, why, and what you guys get up to?
Yeah, so we're a mission-driven company. A lot of people probably say that. MOV3MENT's mission is to decarbonise transport, or to at least accelerate decarbonisation of transport through, the channels that we can influence. That's probably an extension of my journey. So I grew up with a love of cars, bikes, motorbikes, anything with wheels, and then went on to study engineering at mechanical engineering at university, and then went into the auto industry. So I've always kind of worked in the transport space with a love of vehicles. Like many of us, I developed a bit of a social or environmental conscience, let's say. Decided to go back and study sustainability. I saw transport as part of the problem at that point, and thought, I've got to do something about this. And I went off to to either become a journalist or to work in sustainability programs, which I also did for a while. But then very quickly realised, I've still got this passion for transport and fleets and vehicles. I've got this passion for sustainability, and I'll just, cobble them together and make a career out of that. So I did spend a little while working in government in sustainability programs. I spent some time working at other consultancies doing decarbonisation of transport. And then in about 2015, about a decade ago, I started MOV3MENT just to have a bit more control over the sort of projects that we do, and to align my personal mission with, the corporate mission that we have, as I said, which is to decarbonise transport.
Yeah, wow. So, going back with that sort of history, you really are focusing on reducing emissions, where at the moment it seems like a lot of people may be focusing on electric. And it's really a choice between which E is your strategy focused on. So how would you describe the progress in Australia at reducing emissions in the transport sector so far?
I'll just touch on that because I think that's a really important distinction. We work with government, we work with fleets, we work with industry suppliers like vehicle OEMs as well, and fuel suppliers. And you're absolutely right. If you go back when I started MOV3MENT a decade ago, that was, the big focus was decarbonisation, and transport generally is a difficult sector to reduce emissions in. And there were probably more strings to the bow, perhaps is the best way to put it, where people were focused on the CO2, not the technology so much. And I think certainly in the last few years that focus has shifted to how do we electrify. Everyone wants to talk about electric vehicles and decarbonising their fleet through EVs. So there's a big technology focus rather than, well, what's actually the outcome. So to your question then, I guess, around, what progress is being made, there's probably two ways to answer that. One is, are emissions coming down from the transport sector? That's a backward-looking question. So, I guess a lag indicator, so to speak. And overall, no, they're not yet. We certainly, if you look at transport in general, which is, road transport, marine, shipping, rail, aviation, our emissions have been growing. They're starting to stabilise, and maybe by 2030 they'll come back down again. COVID was a bit of a hit to emissions, which is a good thing. It helped reduce emissions for a while, but we've started to go back up again. If you look at the government's projections, by 2030 we'll be back to maybe where we were around 2015, which it's kind of good because it's starting to come down, but actually there's right now we're still growing and stabilising. So there's a retrospective looking, have they come down? Not really, but they will soon. And I think the second part of that question is, what's the plan? How are we going to accelerate that reduction? And that's probably where you've got to treat different parts of transport differently. And if you look at road transport, for example, for light vehicles, so passenger cars, like commercial vehicles, we now have a new vehicle efficiency standard. We were one of the last countries as a holdout that didn't have that kind of a policy in place. And that's probably contributed to the emissions problem that we have in terms of emissions continuing to grow. But with that policy in place, that's going to start driving reductions in emissions. So, big tick there. And provided that it's implemented in a way that, there is actually an incentive or a disincentive against emissions. So, penalties around compliance for vehicle manufacturers, that should be quite effective. If you flip that and look at the heavy vehicles, so trucks and buses, particularly trucks, there's really not a lot in place. So truck emissions are going to continue rising well beyond 2030. And, that's a combination of a growing freight task as well as slow penetration of technologies into the market. It's a really hard sector to decarbonise, and we don't really have the right mix of policies yet in terms of carrots and sticks to encourage the industry to change. And sorry, just on that, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting people are doing the wrong thing. Like in terms of encouraging industry to change, it's a low margin industry. Most of freight in particular is made up of small operators trying to make a buck. They're not doing anything wrong. The policies and the levers there to change their behaviour just aren't there. So it has to start at the top. It's not a bottom-up transition.
Do you think there is an appetite if they had, do they have that social conscience? Do operators understand the impact they're having on the environment? Is there a willingness if it financially made sense?
Look, I think every sector there's probably a spectrum of people, those who absolutely have that environmental conscience, those that don't believe in climate change. I think, I don't think transport's that different to any other sector. It is quite a conservative sector in the sense that, it's slow to change. A truck is a long-lived asset. You've got, with an average age of around 15 years, you've got trucks that are being bought now that are still going to be on the road in 2050, right? Because their average age of 15 years means they're still around for, 25, 30 years.
So are there any government policies that have been implemented over the last 5 or 10 years that have made a difference or started to move that needle a little bit in the road transport space?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess you're talking just about trucks in particular or just in general?
Yeah, just in trucks more, commercial vehicles.
Yeah, I think, again, if we focus not just on electrification, because in the heavy vehicle space, there have been some incentives around to support fleets to transition to electric vehicles. So ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, has grants available for purchasing electric trucks and to build charging to support trucks. So there are incentives in place for that. It's fair to say that the focus has been on bigger fleets, right? And that's fair enough because the part of the objective is to demonstrate the technology and demonstrate the viability of it. So they've been effective as a I guess, a bit of a lighthouse project to show that it is possible to electrify. But as we started talking, in the beginning of this discussion, it's not just about electrification. There are opportunities to reduce carbon emissions that are broader and wider than just electrification. And that's probably one of the areas where we have the biggest gap at the moment, particularly around efficiency and even fuel switching.
Yeah, I think one of the key messages from Movement that I think I've heard at some of your webinars and other presentations is that it doesn't have to be a big ticket investment to make an improvement. That there's some low cost of initiatives that fleets can do just by starting to measure and pay attention to how they can reduce their fuel consumption. Can you just outline some of the ones that you talk about for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. There are, and this is where it gets complex. This is one of the barriers to improvement. As I said before, we've got a lot of small operators, and energy management, energy focus isn't a huge part of doing business. They're trying to keep the truck running and deliver their goods, right? So the complexity comes in terms of, particularly from an efficiency perspective, around saving fuel. That focus has to be on where you're losing energy in the fuel. That's where the emissions are coming from. When you burn fuel, you're releasing emissions. So depending on what you do with the truck, so the different applications that trucks work in, the duty cycles, you might do some different things. So some examples would be trucks that run at high speed on the highway, interstate line haul, for example. They'd need to focus a lot on improving their aerodynamics and streamlining. So you often see trucks, many of them have spoilers on the roof or fairings that extend the cab on the sides, or even skirts on the side of the truck between the wheels, or even on the trailer. We've seen those technologies, a much greater variety of those technologies in other markets that haven't maybe made their way to trucks here in Australia. And so that's one potential opportunity, is improving efficiency through things like aerodynamics. That's one example. Low rolling resistance tyres as a market here in Australia, we're probably, again, behind some of those other markets. So there are, for example, labels, tyre rating labels in Europe and tyre accreditations in the US that qualify a tyre to be a low rolling resistance tyre, which might save you anywhere between 2 to 5% in fuel. It depends on what you were doing before, what kind of tyre you buy. There's a big wide spectrum of savings, but the reality is that single digit percentages in terms of fuel savings are achievable through low rolling resistance tyres, through aero, as I mentioned before, fitting aerodynamic equipment to trucks. And so you end up with, stacking up these small single digits, and you can actually achieve quite reasonable savings in terms of fuel savings, which translate directly to emissions reductions.
Yeah, and things like driver behaviour, idling is a big thing that I hear talked about a lot. They can make significant improvements or reductions in fuel and emissions too. Yeah,
look, I mean, idling. There are vehicles out there that sit there and idling their engine for 20 to 30% of the time that the engine's on, right? So we've seen data through telematics that shows that those vehicles don't use heaps and heaps of fuel. You might get a few, again, single digit percentage points in terms of fuel saving. You get a 3% fuel saving or a 2% fuel saving. It doesn't sound like much, but it adds up. And the reality of that is you're getting both a cost saving and an emissions reduction, and thirdly, a health saving for the community, because an idling diesel engine is spewing out pollution out of the tailpipe for virtually no upfront investment. So it's a quick payback, what we call low hanging fruit. That's a real opportunity to make a saving. You mentioned driver training as well. There's a spectrum of things you can do, everything from sending your drivers off on a training course through to using telematics and feedback systems that give them instant feedback to say, change gear or, down speed, up speed, lots of different strategies to try to reduce fuel consumption, including, anticipating traffic and things like that. The technologies that support that, you can do everything from download an app that people can have on their phone that's giving them direct feedback through to OEM telematics or aftermarket telematics one of the really interesting case studies we saw was we've seen that you can get anywhere from a 15 to 20% fuel saving through driver training and then reinforcing that training. It's not a one-off, it's not set and forget. You've got to reinforce that because you're changing people's behaviours. That's a pretty significant reduction for what is a fairly reasonable upfront cost if you can find a supplier that's going to do that training. And that's one of the biggest gaps is, having suppliers out there who can provide that for smaller fleets. The really interesting case study we saw was going beyond that and actually sharing those fuel savings with the drivers who are achieving those savings.
Yeah,
one
wow.
Of the fleets we talked to was they got an additional 3.5% to 4% saving over and above doing the training.
Yeah, wow. And I suppose that's where maybe collaboration comes in, and not just with government departments, but with the employees as well. So you work closely, and just leading on to collaboration, you work closely with government and private sectors. I'm guessing collaboration is a big part of implementing decarbonisation strategies or accelerating it. There needs to be, the operators in the industry working with the government.
Yep.
Are you seeing more of that happening?
Yeah, we are. I think as a market, Australia's had a few false starts in that sense. There are programs overseas where government works with industry to try to share knowledge around decarbonisation in transport, in freight transport, as well as put programs in place that support companies to make some of those changes. And we've had a few false starts where that's happened with individual states. New South Wales, if I go back a decade, New South Wales was leading with multiple programs in that area. We worked on some of those, worked on programs in Tassie, but there just hasn't been that continuity where, compared with a program in the US, as we talked about before, there's a program called SmartWay that acts almost as a collaboration centre for fleets, for shippers, so the customers of the freight, freight consigners or shippers as we call them, working with fleets and working with government and working with technology suppliers to actually share data, share information, test technologies, share that information, run demonstration programs, that kind of thing. That's been running for 15 years. Our programs tend to be short-lived between election cycles, unfortunately.
Yeah, and but with the federal election, I think it will be decided by the time this podcast goes to live, and it'll be interesting to see what happens post that, because there could be some changes in the market depending on who wins.
Yeah. Look, and I think just to answer your question fully around collaboration, I think more so than in the past, particularly with electrification, where you need infrastructure, you need locations, you need the vehicle technologies, and you need the fleets that are prepared to invest in those because there's a higher upfront cost. There has to be some certainty that's actually going to convince the operator to do that. And so where you get partnerships and collaboration between the freight customer or the shipper and the carrier of that, the fleet operator, and the suppliers, that really improves the certainty around the business case and the confidence that actually this is a partnership that we're in. It's not just all down to me, because in some cases those fleets are the least able to invest in that technology, without that certainty. So one of the programs we've been working on with Queensland Transport and Logistics Council up here in Queensland is supporting precincts like the Port of Brisbane, Brisbane Airport and other freight precincts to actually start considering what these future technologies look like and working with both their tenants and the vehicle suppliers and the energy suppliers to actually start putting some strategic thinking into this and saying, all right, well, where do we need to invest so that you can do your part, and what do you need to do to enable others to do that? And so that's been a great program in terms of connecting those different parties and giving them something else to think about. It's one example, but there's probably dozens of others where more collaboration and more partnerships are going to accelerate this decarbonisation.
Yeah, that sounds like a great example. Just a question. I hadn't really thought about this until now, just listening to you speak, but alternative fuels such as HVO or biodiesel, they seem like they could be opportunities to reduce CO emissions without, especially HVO, without significant infrastructure. Is there much happening in that front?
They are significant opportunities, and maybe the second part of your question, without much infrastructure, probably not. So we've got to make that fuel, or we have to import it, right? So renewable, for those that don't know, renewable diesel is a drop-in substitute for diesel, unlike traditional biodiesel, where you can use it blended with diesel up to about 15-20%. Beyond that, you would need to get approval from your engine manufacturer to maintain the warranty and whatnot. Renewable diesel isn't like that. It's a direct substitute. You could use it at a 100% ratio instead of diesel. And what we've seen is that overseas, where there's really strong policies in place to support renewable diesel, or what they call low carbon liquid fuels, that there's been good uptake. So California is a good example. I know that's a kind of a leading market, but they're using as much renewable diesel in the US as our entire fleet of trucks uses diesel. So you could power our entire Australian fleet of trucks on the amount of renewable diesel that they're making and using over there. So it's not a fringe technology in the sense that it's being experimented with. There's massive amounts of it. We're just not making much of it here in Australia, and we're exporting a lot of the feedstocks to other markets like them, to make a buck on the feedstocks ultimately. So the policies that the government is working on and the incentives arena's putting in place to try to support that market and seed that market here will be effective. It'll be a fuel that we need. It's just not going to be a very quick opportunity. You're trying to grow a whole market to produce fuel.
Yeah, wow. So just to finish off, I was reading some stuff in the press recently that a lot of organisations have sort of net zero targets or emission reduction targets that are starting 2030, 2035. Those dates are creeping up on us, and there's been very little action by a lot of organisations as well. So what advice would you give to a fleet or a transport manager that has got these targets, coming or approaching pretty quickly, but they haven't actually started yet their journey?
I think it's to put a strategy in place. So understand where you're at the moment. Where does your fuel go? How much fuel are you using? What are the biggest users? Whether you have 2 trucks or you have 200 trucks, it's really just about understanding which parts of that fleet use the most fuel and trying to get an understanding of what activities consume that fuel. Once you understand that, you can start to set some targets and say, all right, well, let's say you have half a dozen trucks, and you might have 4 out of those that will not be electrified anytime soon. One of them might be, and the other one might need, let's say, future renewable diesel, or if you could find some down the road that you could use. At the moment, that's still an expensive fuel, so probably not. In the meantime, you've still got 4 trucks that you could be doing something with, and that focus on fuel efficiency is something that you can do relatively fast and immediately. There's information resources out there. We worked with NatRoad, the industry association for fleets in Australia, to put a program together called Get Fleet Fit. There's some fantastic information sheets, advice about the process that you go through, how to analyse your data, a whole bunch of resources to support that, including a couple of case studies, just helping fleets to sort of start to focus on, all right, well, before I even think about electrification, which is an expensive way to decarbonise, I could get reasonable savings to try to reduce emissions and save costs. These aren't even necessarily high-cost items. So the payback is very quick, and it helps build that momentum as well. So some of those efficiency measures are really, really important. Take a look at Get Fleet Fit on the NatRoad website. All those resources are free, and that gives you a good starting point. But I guess that's what I'd say is it's a staged strategy. Don't just think straight away around electrification. It's about understanding where you're at, putting a plan together to say, all right, well, which bits of the fleet am I going to do first? How far will that get me? And can I bank some cost savings in that process on that path and journey to full decarbonisation and electrification?
Yeah, that's a really good tip. Because from all my discussions with fleets, as I think you mentioned earlier, they're busy getting the job done, whether it's delivering freight or running the operation. They don't actually sit back and work out how much fuel do I have, who's using it, who's only doing 10 kilometres a day, then maybe they can swap or do something different. So, so getting the strategy, everyone can do that without any money, really, can't they, with any investment?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, part of that stock take or baseline, as we call it, that first step is actually figuring out why you want to make a change. There's a lot of potential drivers, right? And that's a strategic question that a lot of fleets aren't really asking themselves. Like, what is driving this? Is it a reporting obligation that I have either through the new sustainability reporting standards, right? I need to understand what my emissions are. So that's a compliance, right? That's a big stick that's kind of waving at you that you need to take action on. Is it the opportunity to get new contracts with new customers potentially, right? And so that's an opportunity rather than a risk. It's a way to earn more revenue. Is it cost savings that they're looking for? Trying to figure out what those drivers are. Is it keeping a specific customer happy? Those drivers are the things that are really going to drive change through the organisation and support investment, and getting that clear picture up front as to why. It's really the why question. That's critical.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, that's a really good wrap up, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have the chat. And look forward to hearing more after you've been to the US to the ACT Expo. That sounds really exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward too. Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been great.
Yeah. All right. So that's a wrap for this episode of the Fleet News Group podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this discussion insightful, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. It really helps others find the show. Remember, we release 2 episodes each month, so look out for the next one for more insights and discussions from experts and leaders in our industry. But if you can't wait, scroll through the episodes from the previous 3 seasons, because there's plenty of great conversations to listen to. Until next time, drive safe and stay informed.